A Helios Airways Boeing 737 lands at Larnaca International Airport on a routine flight from London. The crew report abnormal noises coming from the right aft door, and so a full overnight inspection is carried out by maintenance. The check involves what is known as a pressurization leak check, which requires setting the pressurization system from auto to manual. The inspection is completed, but the ground engineer forgets to switch the system back to auto. The following morning, the crew prepared to depart on a charter flight to Prague via Athens. On board are Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten, First Officer Pampos Charalambous, 4 cabin crew members, and 115 passengers. The pilots perform their routine pre-flight procedures, but miss the pressurization system switch, which is still in the wrong position. Subsequent checks are completed as per procedure, and the aircraft takes off just after 9 am. The aircraft begins a steady climb to their assigned altitude of 34,000 feet. As it passes 12,000 feet, the cabin altitude warning horn sounds. This confuses the pilots, as the horn has the same sound as the takeoff configuration warning. This warning sound was followed by a series of overhead panel warning lights illuminating, only adding to the crew's confusion. Among these warning lights is the equipment cooling warning light, which indicates low airflow through the cooling fans, due to the reduced air density at altitude. Shortly after, at 16,000 feet, the captain contacts the company's operations center and reports that the takeoff configuration warning is on. Before speaking to an engineer, the aircraft passes 18,000 feet, where the cabin oxygen masks are automatically deployed. The captain finally manages to speak to an engineer, and repeatedly states that the cooling ventilation fan lights are off. The engineer asks the captain to confirm the pressurization panel is set to auto. The captain begins to display symptoms of oxygen deprivation, known as hypoxia, and disregards the engineer's question, and instead asks him, "Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?" From that moment on, it was radio silence. The aircraft, with an unconscious flight crew, continues the climb to 34,000 feet. At 9:37, the aircraft leaves the Nicosia FIR, or Flight Information Region, and enters the Athens FIR. Several unsuccessful attempts are made to contact the aircraft. At 10:21, the aircraft, following its programmed route, overflies the approach's main navigational fix, the Kilo Echo Alpha VOR. It then proceeds to overfly Athens International Airport, and returns to the VOR and automatically enters a holding pattern. 2 F-16s are dispatched to intercept the aircraft, in order to establish visual contact. They report that no one is in the captain's seat, and the first officer is motionless. During the 10th holding pattern, one of the F-16 pilots observes a person entering the cockpit, sitting down in the captain's seat, and putting on a set of headphones. This person is Flight Attendant Andreas Prodromo, who is miraculously still conscious due to the use of portable oxygen bottles available to flight attendants. Shortly after, with the aircraft running out of fuel, the left engine flames out, forcing the aircraft into a descending left turn. 5 minutes later, Andreas, who is struggling to remain conscious, sends out a series of distress calls to Athens Air Traffic Control. These calls are never heard, as the radios are still tuned to Nicosia Area Control Center, who at this stage are well out of range. It is only at 7,000 feet when Andreas finally acknowledges the F-16s escorting the aircraft. At 11:59, the right engine also flames out due to fuel starvation. The 737 becomes a glider, and continues to descend rapidly. Despite Andreas' best efforts, the aircraft crashes into the hillside near Grammatiko village, 33 kilometers northwest of Athens International Airport. Emergency responders, still hopeful for possible survivors, struggle to reach the crash site due to the uneven terrain. To make matters worse, the only road available was blocked due to an overturned fire truck. Upon finally reaching the crash site, the responders' worst nightmare came true: a completely destroyed aircraft. All 6 crew members and 115 passengers were killed, with most of the passengers still strapped to their seats. Investigators look at the issues experienced in the previous flight, and the procedure followed by the engineer for the pressurization leak check. This maintenance check involves having a flight engineer in the cockpit, controlling the position of a device known as an outflow valve. The outflow valve, usually controlled automatically, helps an aircraft maintain a specific level of pressurization. If it's closed, airflow builds up in the cabin, therefore pressurizing it. If the aircraft is too pressurized, the outflow valve opens until the desired level has been met. To carry out the test on the ground, the engineer had to set the pressurization system to manual, which allowed him to manually control the position of the outflow valve. Since the switch was never turned back to auto, the outflow valve remained open, which meant the cabin would never automatically pressurize. Whenever the pressurization system is in this setting, a green manual light turns on, reminding pilots of the current setting. This crucial mistake became the center of the investigation, which left investigators wondering how it was never detected through the different stages of flight. The pre-flight, after start, and after takeoff checklists all provided an opportunity to catch the mistake, which was completely missed. Naturally, since the aircraft was not pressurized, the cabin altitude warning horn sounded. Unfortunately, this sound was the same as the takeoff configuration warning, which ensures pilots do not take off in an inappropriate configuration. Analysis on the flight data recorder suggested that the pilots were suspecting it was a faulty takeoff configuration warning, as their initial reaction was to close the thrust levers and advance them again. To add to this, when the flight crew initially contacted the company's operations center, they mentioned having a takeoff configuration warning issue. It was clear from this that the pilots were experiencing a level of cognitive tunneling, where their main focus was on the takeoff configuration warning instead of what the aircraft was trying to tell them, a cabin altitude warning. Instead of leveling off the aircraft to troubleshoot the issue, the aircraft continued to climb, which only made matters worse as the crew and passengers began feeling the symptoms of hypoxia. Hypoxia is a condition in which your body is deprived of oxygen. As altitude increases, pressure decreases, and with it, the amount of oxygen. A breath of air at 18,000 feet will contain roughly half the amount of oxygen at sea level. As a result, the higher the altitude, the less time it takes for physical and mental impairment to kick in. This time is known as the time of useful consciousness. The workload and stress in the cockpit was high during the climb, and by the time the captain finished talking to the company's operations center, they were at 29,000 feet, where the time of useful consciousness is around a minute. A lack of effective crew resource management, or CRM, during the climb was found to have highly contributed to their inability to notice the pressurization setting. The appropriate course of action for such an event would have been to level off to troubleshoot the problem, which would have avoided the onset of hypoxia, buying the pilots more time. The first officer's training record was also one of the main focuses in the investigation. There were several remarks and observations relating to the first officer's struggle to follow SOPs and correctly use checklists. This struggle was found to most likely explain why the first officer did not notice the pressurization mode selector. The onset of hypoxia and stress would have only added to the struggle. Andreas, the flight attendant in the cockpit, actually held a valid commercial pilot license, but was unfortunately not rated on the 737. Together with immense stress and hypoxic conditions he was under, he was unable to take full control of the aircraft. This was made worse when the left engine flamed out, as it would have made controlling the aircraft even harder. One thing the F-16 pilots did report was that an input was made to minimize the impact with the ground. Although all the odds were against him, Andreas was still determined and committed to get the aircraft down as safely as possible. Considering the extremely high stress, confusion and hypoxia he was experiencing, his actions are ones which can only be praised. As a result of this accident, Boeing made a revision to the flight crew training manuals, which included a section on air systems and the cabin altitude warnings. The aim of this new section was to help crew recognize the differences between the cabin altitude warning and the takeoff configuration warning. Changes were also made to the aircraft maintenance manual. After a pressurization leak check, the original manual instructed ground engineers to put the aircraft into its original state. This was considered too generic, so an extra step was added, which specified selecting the mode selector to auto at the end of the check. To this date, Helios Airways Flight 522 remains the deadliest aviation accident in Greek history.